afternoon, depending on where you happen to be on the globe today. I'm Carol Ann Logue. I am the director and co-founder of the Central Florida Tech Grove, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to our August 2024 NTSA Tech Grove Connect webinar. We started this series a few years ago in partnership with NTSA to shine a spotlight on those teams that have done amazing work in modeling, simulation, and training, and whose work was nominated for and or selected as best papers and tutorials in the most recent ITSEC. So those that we're showcasing this year are obviously from ITSEC 2023. I wanted to take just a few minutes to tell you about the Central Florida Tech Grove, as some of you may not be familiar with who we are. We haven't been around that long. We are physically anchored in Orlando, Florida. That is where our physical facility is. And Orlando is the heartbeat, if you will, of the Department of Defense modeling, simulation, and training activity for our military. All of the services are located there. Multiple government entities, federal DoD and national security entities. Here's just a quick slide to show you the mission of Team Orlando, which I will say is a collaboration by choice of all of these federal and state and local entities. No one said you have to work together. So in Orlando, we have an incredibly collaborative environment among the federal, academic, and industry players in human performance in the military. It's anchored, as I mentioned, by the four main services. Space Forces has a presence as well, as do all of these other federal organizations. The next time I show this slide, it will be updated actually with a few more federal organization logos, because the unusual collaboration there in Orlando in this space is really drawing other entities to come take advantage of the information sharing, the joint problem solving activities, especially that Tech Grove enables. And we literally all live together in the Central Florida Research Park. As you can see, it is a campus where all these entities have people on the ground within this 1,000-acre research park. So there really fosters a lot of collaboration, a lot of industry located, not only in the park, but close by as well. Lots of opportunities to engage with us in Orlando as well. This is just one set of activities that takes place every month. There's an opportunity for you to engage with government, academia, and other industry participants. Other than TSIS and ITSEC on this slide, all those other activities take place actually in Tech Grove, as we have become a really critical piece of expanding and increasing the collaboration between not only the entities that are part of Team Orlando, but the broader human performance community. Tech Grove, we are a DoD-funded innovation hub. We opened our doors in January of 2021, virtually. And what's a little bit unusual about us is that while we were created under an agreement executed by the Naval Air Warfare Center Training Systems Division, anchored there in Orlando, from day one, we were funded by multiple DoD entities. You see the logos there of those that are our current customers. We have two more we're adding for FY25 as well. So what do we do for them? Well, this is the space where we focus, because this is where our customers are working in research and development and acquisition and contracting, and lots of industry engagement, particularly that we've been able to foster even more of it at Tech Grove, to understand what's out there in the commercial world and academia, even in other government organizations, that could help accelerate getting cutting-edge solutions to our warfighters. And we have three missions, really. It is to grow the defense industrial base and bring entities and innovators to the table to participate that aren't in this space yet, but really have cutting-edge capabilities that maybe are out there in the commercial sector, or they're in development in R&D. We do a lot to support the transfer and transition of technology, whether it's licensing, whether it's cooperative research and development agreements, commercialization phase 3 of SBIR and STTR innovations, and then finding solutions. We execute on a number of initiatives all the time. We have multiple initiatives going on, actually, where we are going out and we are doing tech scans, we're doing prize challenges, we're doing tabletop exchanges to give you an opportunity to participate and make our customers and other members of Team Orlando aware of what you can bring to the table to more rapidly bring innovative solutions to our warfighters and the military. This is just a list of a lot of things that we do. We have a lot of different activities. I really hope that you will visit our website. And if you are not on our information distribution list, please fill out the contact form on our website, centralfloridatechgrove.org, so you can be aware of all the opportunities that we offer you to engage with us and ultimately, therefore, our customers and help grow your business, help bring your capabilities to the table. As you can see, there's a flyer. Every month we put this flyer out. It's on our website of the activities and initiatives that we have that are open to the public and to you to participate in. We have a lot of things that are a little bit more behind the scenes. Friday, or tomorrow actually, obviously, this is an example of one of the tabletop exchanges that we do. This is for PEO STRI, the Program Executive Office for Simulation, Training, Research, and Instrumentation for the Army. Industry signing up to come to the table and share ideas and insights around 4 problem statements that PEO STRI has given us. And this is going to lay the groundwork for a prize challenge, actually, that will likely be released later this year or early FY25. We do a lot, as I mentioned, for SBIR, STTR. We have a whole series of training programs going on right now. This is our launch pad coming up just ahead of the release of the next DoD SBIR STTR solicitation. So if you're interested in those programs or even have participated but would like to get some great inside tips about how to increase your chances to secure one of those awards, I invite you to sign up to join us. It is hybrid. You can be there in person or virtually. I mentioned prize challenges. This is the one that we have active right now. We have 2, actually 3 more that are in the pipeline that will be released over the next few months. So this is a chance to actually secure some cash should you surface as one of the 3 winners of the prize challenges. And again, connect with us. Go to our website. We have a very active LinkedIn page. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube. Actually, I see I've still got Twitter there. We need to change that to X, but we're very easy to find. And we look forward to having you join us and bring your capabilities to the table. But now let's get to the reason that you all really came to join us this morning. And that is, it's my wonderful pleasure to welcome Jenn McNamara. Her partner, Mike, could not join us today, but that's okay. Jenn can carry the day here on this fascinating topic of guidelines and this work that she and her collaborators have been doing to really provide some insights and guidance around making serious games more accessible to a broader community. So Jenn, with that, welcome. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you, ma'am.
Great. Thank you, Carol Ann, and thank you for inviting me. So I was, as you just heard, invited to share with you the presentation that was originally given as part of ITSEC last year. And I was so excited to have this work accepted by the community because, as I'll talk about in a moment, these really aren't topics that have been, in my mind, well addressed within our development space. So one thing that I want to make sure is very clear, the paper that we wrote is really packed with many links and references, discussion in great detail of a lot of these accessibility concepts. It gives you lots of information about materials, resources you can utilize, and guidelines for you to follow. In the talk today, I'm just going to cover some of those resources at a very high level. But then what I plan to show you today are examples of things that just don't convey as well in a paper. So, things that work in a paper are in the paper, and I encourage you to go ahead and get that. I believe that the information for accessing the paper will be shared with everyone, and I think it's available, to anyone who's in the webinar. So if this is a topic that is a hot issue for you, I recommend that you do look at what we pulled together as resources to share in that paper. So I am not myself an accessibility expert. I'm not trained in accessibility. It's not really my background. What I am is someone who runs a game development company. I run a team that builds serious games for customers in defense, for customers in homeland security, for healthcare and medical customers, for corporate customers, and even education. And really, what we've always heard was, well, what do we have to do about accessibility when we're building these products? And the answer has always been, well, just do the basic things and it's fine, it'll have an exemption. So until very recently, we as an organization that does all funded development had never had the opportunity nor the funding to actually try to build an accessible serious game. And that all changed a couple of years ago. It was actually during the pandemic, but that all changed when we got an inquiry from a customer. One of their users basically said, why can't I access this product using JAWS? And if you're not familiar, JAWS is a commercially available screen reader. It is the most prevalent screen reader used by people who have vision differences and need that accommodation. It actually was even funnier because it went on to say that when I start your product, I can tell there's a video playing, but I don't have any controls and I can't interact with it. And honestly, there was no video playing, right? This was actually a game that had been entered into, but it just gives you a sense of, if you don't have the ability to see what's happening on screen, you have no idea what the product that you've just launched into is sharing with you. So really this, why can't I access the product using JAWS, launched me on this personal research and discovery of just how we could make games more accessible. And as I said, I wasn't an expert in this space, and I was so fortunate to meet my co-author, Michael Brooks, who both is at the Penn State University and also is a consultant in accessibility. And he helps companies make their products more accessible, design accessibly, and provide VPATs, which I'll explain a little bit further on into the presentation. And he's been an amazing guide to work with. So what do I mean when I talk about disability, right? I think that it's very obvious that most of us think of disability and we can think about things like, visual disabilities or motor disabilities, but really there's a very broad range of disabilities. There's cognitive and speech disabilities, there's hearing disabilities. And when you think about the broad spectrum of disabilities, they are not one size fits all, right? If most people, if I were to ask and survey, would say they know someone with ADHD. ADHD is considered a cognitive disability, right? Different levels of speech therapy have been needed for speech disabilities. So it doesn't necessarily, when we talk about disability and helping people, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about someone who is completely blind or completely deaf, or, there's just this broad spectrum, and many disabilities can co-occur. So really what you find is that everyone's unique. And just similar to how every person is unique and has a different background, digital accessibility really is unique as well. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So every user is going to come to your product with a different need and a different expectation of that product. So it makes it really challenging for developers. But The good thing is that there are many standard assistive technologies that exist. So the best thing that we as developers can do is support users' native technologies. So I mentioned JAWS before, there's also NVDA, but people use these standard screen readers, right? Or people use the standard controls built into the operating system on the computer or to the browser or to their mobile device. And the biggest lesson that I've learned is that in the disability community, people don't want to come to your product and have to relearn how to use the accommodations you provide. They want you to meet them with those standard technologies that they're using. So the best thing that we can do is endeavor to support those native technologies that everyone's already using, right? And why would we even want to do this in the first place, right? So it really is congressionally mandated under the Americans with Disability Act that all electronic information and communication technologies are supposed to be accessible to people with disabilities at the same level as they are to a non-disabled person. And then because this is, and sponsored by the organization, and many of you are coming out of the defense space, we do also have the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which is 39.2, which also requires us to comply with ADA. So it is regulated. Now, with that said, we fall into a little bit of a gray area, right? So serious game technologies have typically, I've been doing this since 2000, I think is when I started making games for defense and serious games. And my company has been around since 1998. And these regulations have been in place most of that time. And as I said, when I started this talk, almost always we hear, it's okay, you've got an exemption or you've got an exception depending on the client. So just do your best to, do the bare minimum, but we're not going to worry about accessibility. It's not going to be an issue for this program. So what are these exceptions and exemptions that we could fall under? So basically, under the exemptions, basically, if you have a legacy system that hasn't been altered since January of 2018, you're not required to bring it up to the current accessibility standards, right? Also, if you're putting accommodation into a product would cause what's referred to as undue burden, and they define that as significant difficulty or expense relative to your project timeline or budget, you can have an exemption. When accommodations would fundamentally alter the nature of the application and thus lessen the overall experience for most users, you can have an exemption. And then if no conforming commercial options exist, you can also have an exemption, right? And that's a pretty broad range of exemptions. And especially given that I haven't seen really almost any products in the modeling and simulation space that are taking these factors into account, you can see how our products would easily fall under an exemption rule. Then on top of that, we pile on exceptions, which can be given. And there's a couple categories of exceptions, but they include some military procurements, national security systems, and then there's this category of computer technologies that are used either in-house by a contractor or for maintenance, repair, and monitoring of equipment in spaces. So basically not being used by an end operator. So it's a pretty broad set of exceptions and exemptions. So legally, I would say that most of the technologies that we all work with can fall under this category and be considered exempt or take an exception, right? However, I really do feel that times have changed and technologies are advancing. And my goal is to challenge us to start thinking as a community about how we stop taking those exceptions and exemptions and see how we can give more to our end users. Okay. So in this case, I am focused primarily on serious games, but many of these points will carry over to other technologies, right? So serious games really are unique from other products in a number of ways. So for one, I'm going to say I'm not talking about, console games that people are playing at home. I'm really talking about games that we're either going to deliver over the web or as apps. I'm talking about games that are built using commercial game engines, typically Unity or Unreal in our space. And then they leverage HTML5 and the canvas for graphics delivery. That's just how these technologies work. What's interesting about serious games versus just entertainment games is that they really can impact people's livelihood, right? They can be used in hiring decisions. They can be used for training. They can be used for assessment, for promotion, for credentialing. So when you start to think about what's going to come as an outcome from these games, it really does become increasingly important that we think about making sure all users have access and fair access to the products, right? Now, when we look at serious games, their design actually draws from a number of influences. So entertainment games, absolutely first and foremost, is one. But we also draw from instructional systems design and also web design, given the platforms that we're delivered on. And that's going to be helpful to us as we start to think about how we would apply accessibility guidelines to games. Then the next thing to think about is that typically for me as a third-party developer, I create a game that is then going to be delivered through some organization's website, right? So if I build a game for a credentialing body, such as the games that I'm going to talk about where I learned these lessons, those are delivered on their corporate website. So when that corporate website determined the accessibility goals and they put a statement out on their website saying that they comply with a certain level of accessibility, and I'll talk in a moment about what those levels of accessibility are, your product is then consumed under that umbrella. So you're expected to meet the same target. So often the level of accessibility that you provide is outside of your control or your determination and becomes a requirement for a program. So it really does make sense for us, given looking at all of these elements, to turn to these different diverse disciplines, to these corporate guidelines and regulations, and try to figure out what requirements actually could be leveraged and applied for serious games. So I'll start out by saying there are no accessibility guidelines specifically targeting serious games or even games.
Jenn, I'm curious,
Yeah.
just is there any kind of somewhat reliable data available of the audience for serious games that this impacts, this lack of accessibility? I know that's got to be a hard thing to measure, but what have you seen?
Yeah, so I don't actually have data on that, but because serious games are used widely, but I don't know, the
Right.
breadth
Yeah.
of distribution.
Yeah.
But in the general population, given the classification of different disabilities,
Mm-hmm.
they say it's something like 80% of individuals have some level of disability. Now, obviously and honestly, in the defense segment, one of the things that people always say is, well, we're training pilots or we're
Right.
training,
Right. Yeah.
surgeons. And
Right.
very often you see a lower incidence of certain types
Right.
of disabilities in those
Mhm.
populations for sure.
Makes sense. Yeah.
But if you start to think about things like ADHD, that's not
Yeah.
the case, right? You will even
Mhm.
see, more people in those populations.
Mhm.
So
80%. Good grief.
yes.
Wow.
So
Shush.
as we start to think about where we could turn for guidance, right? As I said, there's no serious game
Mhm.
actionable guidelines out there. So I started as a game developer and I turned to the best source I know, which is the IGDA, the International Game Developers Association, and they have a game accessibility special interest group. So I went there and I sort of looked at what they had to offer. And game developers to be honest, have done a lot of work for accessibility, but most of the efforts that you see in this space are efforts centered around game consoles, creating very unique and specific input and output devices or hardware for certain classes or populations of users. And often these efforts have been championed and created by and for specific users with disabilities. You know, there's a gentleman who was blind who really wanted to be able to play first-person shooters. He was previously sighted, lost his vision, so he knew how to play those games. So he started working to adapt those games. That's sort of a typical story of what you would hear from the historical support for accessibility. There are some different examples, and many of the game companies have now hired accessibility consultants, but none of that information is making it out to be sort of common standard practice or shared, you know, with the broader community. So the two resources that I found targeting the game space were the Able Gamers Association, their accessible games information, which really discusses accessible player experiences. And then the game accessibility guidelines. Now, these are two different resources that are put out. I do have links to them in the paper, but the Able Gamers information basically focuses on presenting you with challenge patterns and experience patterns, right? So what they're looking at is how can you engage all players in your game narrative and play experiences, right? And the game accessibility guidelines, they actually break accessibility into 3 levels. So they talk about when you're evaluating your product and trying to decide where to invest in accessibility, you should look at the reach, meaning the number of people who could benefit, the impact, so the difference made to those people by implementing accessibility accommodations, and then the value or the cost to implement. And I really liked the way that they lay out that organizing of their recommendations. And then they further break the organization of their guidelines down to motor, cognitive, vision, hearing, speech, and general as categories. And they've got a pretty cool downloadable Excel item or Excel file that you can use to actually track items in their categories and to consider different elements of the game. So whether you're looking at these cards that are provided by Able Gamers, and you can find those digitally or get an actual paper deck to use them as you're working on a design, or whether you're using the game accessibility guidelines, both of these for us as a company were really helpful for us to think about different principles for design and how we can make our designs in general more accessible. But they didn't actually give us an answer to what's required, how we help to protect our clients from any legal liability when it comes to someone who has a need for an accessibility accommodation, feeling like they're not utilized. So while they were very helpful to us and they helped us to really think about affordances that we could build into design and how we could challenge our design elements in our games, they didn't give us the answer to what's required and what do we need to do. So we continued our search and found the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And these are really WCAG's, the evolving standards from the W3 Consortium. These are what are basically considered the gold standard that people judge accessibility and levels of accessibility by in the space. Sorry, I almost knocked over a bottle of water. In the space. So they were really written with the goal of working with the native technologies that people are using for assistive technology. And then they're organized around what they call the POUR principles. You see those listed here on screen, that you look at things being perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. They also break the guidelines out into a version and numbering system. So they're presented, we're basically in WCAG 2 right now. So there was 2.0, 2.1, now there's 2.2. And that was released, back October, November of last year. Each of the guidelines then have a level A, a level AA, and a level AAA. As you add A's, they become more stringent, and then thus providing more accessibility. Most commercial organizations strive to achieve a level of WCAG 2.1 AA as their standard. Some go beyond that. Some, are below that, but that tends to be what most organizations are trying to hit, and a generally acceptable level. When there are links to all of the WCAG guidelines in the paper as well. And when you look at those, they provide information about how to implement certain types of accessibility accommodations and what types of requirements you would have. They also introduce the use of something called a VPAT, which is a voluntary template that you can use to actually describe and explain to people what accommodations you have made in your product. Now, and that's something, honestly, that we could do an entire talk on as well. But using a VPAT is a very good thing, and it's something that every organization should embrace, because it's your opportunity to help people to understand what you've done, right? Now, following the letter of WCAG, most serious games could still honestly claim an exception, at least currently, because that guideline hasn't evolved to cover some of the types of dynamic content that serious games are. But what we chose to do is to view WCAG more as a guideline, to deliver to its spirit, and really try to align with the intention of a standard or guideline versus trying to implement it directly. Another thing that I will say is, while WCAG is very good at giving us guidelines and standards, the standards are not explicitly spelled out such that they can be used without interpretation. So they're sort of guiding principles, but you do have to consider those principles against your design and development work. So I'm going to give a couple examples of how some of these guidelines applied to our work.
Jenn, one of the questions we have here is, do you have any content supporting implementing accessibility as a starting place to support better product user experience? I think you'll find that, yes, in this presentation, as we continue through it, that's you'll begin to see some of that. Yeah.
Yes. And again, so if it's a game-based product, I definitely recommend looking at things like those game accessibility guidelines and the accessible play, the experience cards from Able Gamers. Those are great at just challenging design assumptions right up front. And then you'll see that we have some actionable information in here as we move forward, and definitely in the paper. Okay. So there's a number of guidelines that are honestly pretty simple to address and pretty simple to meet. And even throughout time, as organizations have been taking exemptions to the requirements for accessibility, most games have strived to achieve some of these, right? So we see here, looking at color contrast as an example. It's funny because even simple guidelines like those on color contrast have many aspects to them in WCAG. And we couldn't even fully discuss one guideline in the time that we have here together. So I'm just going to share some very high-level points. But as an example, if we look at color contrast, I had mentioned that there's an A level, a AA, and a AAA level. So to achieve the sort of lowest level of color contrast, so support of the contrast between your text on screen and your background color, wherever your text is placed, or images, also your buttons and how they stand out, any sort of control mechanism, how they stand out off of the background of your game. This is what we're talking about when we talk about color contrast. At the A level, they want you to have a 3-to-1 color contrast, right? And that's considered that it's discernible to average sighted users. At the AA level, which remember is where I said most organizations try to hit, they recommend a 4.5-to-1 color contrast in the colors you're using for, let's say, your text versus the button, right? At that level, it's basically generally considered perceivable to someone with 20/40 vision. Yes, I'm seeing some notes in the comment about the contentiousness around the WCAG development efforts and the complexities around color contrast. But 20/40 vision is considered sort of average visual acuity for someone at about age 80, right? And then at AAA level, they recommend 7-to-1. And really at that point, you're getting to beyond 20/80 vision, you're looking at people would be using some sort of assistive technology, right? Now, what gets complex here is you layer on top of those recommendations things like the size of the font, when the font is being used, if it's an active or disabled state, if it's considered decorative text, if it's an element in an image that isn't relevant to comprehending or completing a task. So you get all of these little sub-factors that influence if you need to hit these same levels or different levels. So just to give you the example of how complex things can be. There are lots of tools out there that you can use to sort of analyze your color contrast. One we use is this color contrast analyzer that you see here. It's literally just a little plugin that you can throw onto your screen, and you can hover over different colors, add them into the contrast checker, and it will actually give you the contrast checker. So here for this, blue and green or turquoise and black, you see the example text preview here, and that's giving you a 10.4-to-1 ratio. So we do have lists of some of these kinds of helpful tools that are freely available for people to use. And of course, color contrast is also different based upon every screen resolution. So what you're trying to do is, implement to the best intention you can based upon what you expect your end users to be using. But you do have to realize there will be variability. So another thing that is relatively simple to implement, although there are some complexities, as there are with all of the factors, are captions. So a lot of what we do, we're adapting from games. And what we do in games is actually very often adapted from what people set as expectations from video players or television, right? I think we're all used to seeing captions available on television or in movies. And when you're using true captions, they're going to be time synced with speech. You're going to indicate who's speaking. You're going to hear, see any other things that you would hear. So sounds in the background, creaking of stairs, those things are described in text so that you get the full sound context. Now, in games, sometimes we don't actually get the ability to have captions generated if we have dynamic text being typed in or dynamic speech being generated. So in some cases, we may have to use other tools to just parse speech. And we know those aren't always 100% reliable, but that is something that we can still do and offer. But definitely for anything that is pre-recorded or narrative in your game, you should be able to use these sort of standard caption functions. I will also say that any of the images that you're seeing throughout the presentation are all from the different resources that we've recommended. So those game accessibility guidelines, they actually do a great job for each of the guidelines of finding people who need the accommodation, having them speak to what the accommodation does for them or how it helps, showing examples from games of good and poor implementations to meet a guideline. So all of these have come from those examples. This is just talking about text descriptions for diagrams, right? So anytime you've got a diagram or an instruction, you should ensure that you don't rely upon a graphic alone or text alone, that you combine them, basically, right? You want to have graphical text alternatives matching each other to support users with assistive technology as well, because that will help to give something to be read by your screen readers and things of that sort. So now we're going to talk about user-focused descriptions. So when you should always provide descriptions of images, and probably most of you are starting to see this even if you're not working in accessibility, but you'll see when you put even an image into PowerPoint or into Word that it's now asking you for that alt text. You know, what should be the text to describe this image? And when you write those descriptions, one of the things is that you really need to understand what the image is being used for. So sometimes images are just decorative, and in that case, they don't necessarily have to be described, or you can just describe, you know, it's decorative to show something. But when you're using an image to illustrate something important to a learning context or to an assessment context, the way you describe it becomes much more important. Right? So if you see the two images on screen here, one is actually just an image that might have been used to talk about, you know, OSHA and job site training. And whether it's a sunny day or a cloudy day has no bearing to the inside work that these people are doing right now, right? So when you describe this, you wouldn't have to say it's a sunny day, we see two men doing work, holding a beam. You would just define and describe the relevant elements of the image. Now, the image on the bottom, if you look at that, that's actually explaining a water cycle experiment. So the sun being present is actually important. The cloud being present, the rain, those things would be important to describe in your alt text, right? So really, when you are describing things, whether it's images, whether it's tables, whether it's activities, you need to have some subject content knowledge. And then it can also become tricky because very often what we were doing when we were building this product, it was actually a credentialing tool. So we had to be careful that we weren't describing the images in such a way that we would be guiding a disabled user to more easily or readily answer correctly or incorrectly, right?
Yeah.
So you need to describe the salient features of something in an assessment to make sure somebody can complete the activity, but not do so in such a way that you reveal the answers or make the test easier, if you will, or harder for someone with a disability to complete. So you can envision how creating those image descriptions and activity descriptions and the rest can become quite complex.
Jenna, I'm just thinking, I see that alt text popping up all the time, and you're really making me much more aware of the importance of that and how to use it. How would you recommend, though, that I really understand from the user that has a disability of some sort, get smarter about how to craft those? Because I can try to imagine what it's like for somebody, but I can't really relate to it. Somebody that's sight impaired.
Yeah, so, and you want to be as concise as possible because people don't want to read paragraphs about an image, but you just have to give whatever information is relevant. And usually as a content expert, you know why the image is being used and what's important from it to convey. So we rely upon those experts to work with them. Okay, so I'm going to move a little bit quickly through some of these. This next concept is really starting as we start to talk about screen readers. If you've never heard a screen reader or seen someone using a screen reader, it is very different, I think, than many people would envision. So some things I'll say is people who use screen readers want very concise information. They tend to set their screen readers to read very fast, and they tend to be very used to and expect you to navigate a site in a meaningful way. So I'm just going to play this little video quickly for you.
Able gamers combating social isolation through play document. Able gamers combating social isolation through play. Link up our mission. Skip links, navigate list. Skip the main content, same page link. Same page link, skip the footer list end. Skip links, navigation region end. The Able Gamers Charity. The world's largest charity for gamers with disabilities. Main menu, navigation region. List of 5 items. Link our mission. Our mission button link our work. Our work button collapsed. Link get help. Get help button collapsed. Link ways to give. Ways to give. Link our story. Our story but list end. Main menu, navigation region. A list of 2 items. Link donate.
Okay. I think that gives you an idea of what it sounds like for someone using a screen reader. So you heard very fast speech. You heard description of button, whether a button was collapsed or open, whether a menu was collapsed or open, what the thing said, whether it was a navigation element or whether it was text on a page. So you hear those little descriptions. And when you program the information to go to the screen reader, you actually can divide your screen into meaningful blocks and segments. And you should make it so that people can skip elements on your navigation that are consistently presented and things of that sort. So those are some of the types of things that we have to start to think about implementing in games. When someone's using JAWS or NVDA, there's actually a desire to have full keyboard operability, meaning that if you can't use a mouse, you're going to want to use quick keys and your keyboard to navigate everything. So you could be using arrows and the tab key and things of that sort. But there's actually a whole set of quick keys that are standard for using these technologies. And I don't share this here. It's kind of an eye chart. It's easy to find, but I share it to say the big thing you want to do is you want to make sure you're not using any of these quick keys for other uses in a product you're creating. Because if you do that, then you're going to override or fight with what's being provided in the native assistive technology. Looking at user flow, I think I mentioned that people are going to expect to navigate a website in a standard way. So here you see tabbing through a web page, right? So another web accessibility evaluation tool. And you can see how if I was using keyboard controls to tab through, it's going through the menu items first, down through the page, and then going through the links in the page. And it would be reading each of these as it's doing it. I didn't have the audio on for this video because I'm just trying to show that there is a logical and expected pattern for how you would flow through your product. Now, it's pretty obvious what those patterns might be in something like a web page. But when you move to something like a game, what is the appropriate user flow? We don't really have many guidelines. So we have to look at our product and determine what is our intended consumption order. And how do we make sure that someone using keyboard controls and tabbing through the game would reasonably be able to navigate and understand what's going on in the system? So this is a game that was used to familiarize pediatric patients going through treatments at the National Institutes of Health with the hospital environment and the types of equipment and things that they would encounter. So here, your tab order, we might want to go through the different rooms that are across the top and then jump into the main screen and interact with the equipment. But you can see how there's menu elements that are going to be here routinely, returning to the lobby, being able to look around, move around the space. But you can still imagine a pretty reasonable top-down flow for a UI like this. And this is, just these are not numbers we put on the screen. These are for our benefit for the presentation to say our tab flow here really is just through that top menu, through the main elements on the screen, and then through the bottom menu. Now, when you look at something like a more complex system, so this UI is for a medical record-driven nurse training tool for managing patients across your nursing floor. What is the appropriate user flow? We've got patients who appear across the bottom of the screen. We've got a screen on the left where we can see an image of the patient, their vitals, information about them. On the right, we have access to their medical record, to their medications, to their current present illness descriptions, to an ability to examine them. you can start to look at this and just see that as a designer, you're going to have to put a lot of thought into how to familiarize someone in a meaningful way to this system as you're laying out your user flow. Now, for those first few design concepts that I showed you, the contrast, the captions, the text descriptions, those were all pretty straightforward for us to implement. We could do those pretty much following WCAG, and we could implement them using the standard game engines. Wasn't that hard to do. But when we move to things like the user flow, the keyboard navigation, the screen reading, those require the assistive technologies to have direct access to your code to work. Because game engines deliver content through HTML5 and render it to a canvas, that canvas isn't actually available for direct access to your end assistive technology. So it's basically just a black box of hidden stuff that can't be perceived by assistive technology. So what we did, and the creative approach we took, is that we basically created middleware, which placed a layer on top of that canvas that was readable by HTML5 and standard HTML5, and that would sync with the activities that you were performing in game. So it was basically just a hidden layer. It had nothing on it that could be seen. But if we needed to highlight things on screen, they were highlighted in that hidden layer. If you were using button clicks, they were communicated through that layer. And that actually made it so that we could expose what was on the hidden canvas to the assistive technologies and sync it with, and have it actually control the game and send output back to the game, or back to you, to the user, and the assistive technologies from the game. There's lots of complexities with this because you are syncing, a hidden screen and making sure that things line up nicely. And there's lots of potential gotchas, right? But it basically did work for us and made it that we were able to implement a WCAG solution. Now, I've said many times in this presentation that the preferred method of providing accessibility accommodations is to use people's native technologies, right? So use those assistive technologies, their screen readers, their browser functions, their operating system functions. But there are some times that you just can't, right? And if you can't, there are other tools available. So there is the UI accessibility plugin for Unity, which is called UAP. It's a third-party plugin not provided by Unity. And then there's the Apple accessibility plugin for all Apple devices. These plugins are interesting because they will replicate the functions of assistive technology. So when you use UAP, it's going to build screen reading into your product. It is not the preferred method. The preferred method is absolutely that you work with JAWS or NVDA, or the native screen reading in the operating system. But if you truly can't do that, or if your budget doesn't allow for it and you're using Unity, for instance, you can use UAP and at least offer the ability for people to learn a new way of interacting with your system and to expose for them the ability to utilize accessibility controls. Apple's a little bit different because it is rendering things out to work with its standard operating system built in accessibility affordances. So that Apple accessibility plugin is actually a great solution, but only if all of your users are on Apple, because it's not going to do anything for your Android users. It's not going to do anything for Windows, right? It's only for using Apple technology. So I hope that today I was able to share just a couple examples of some of the things that we encountered and did, and the thinking and the complexity that went behind it. But bottom line, we were able to make WCAG 2.1 AA compliant game-based assessments that are out there in the wild being used today. People are successfully using them with their assistive technologies. And I do hope that we can open this conversation and have more people consider trying to build accessibility into their products within our space.
So Thank you, Jen. There are a couple other things that come to mind that, based on what I saw in your paper, you talk about some of the barriers to organizations pursuing these accessibility tools, but yet you also start to talk about the business value of doing that. Could you address that a little bit, please?
Yeah, so I mean, the business value of doing this. So it really depends and varies based upon your business, right? So the world has changed, and people now expect that the information that are interacting with is going to be accessible. So there are a lot of legal cases that are being brought against organizations that are not providing accessible products and tools. So one of the things that is happening is, for fear of litigation, people are starting to do more of this work. So that's not necessarily a, how does this enhance my bottom line, but it is a, how do I prevent
Right.
being in that case.
A negative motivation rather than a positive one.
Yeah, but there's also the side of, with us struggling to find, good employable workers and things of that sort. It expands the population of people that you can bring into your organization. It expands the number of people that you can bring in as employees. And really it makes it so that you have a more diverse population working for you if you can make these accommodations. So it's less about a bottom line impact to see increased revenue, I would say. And there are definitely costs associated. I would say for us, I would say there's about a 30 to 40% additional cost to build accessibility into a product from the start. It's much harder to go back and retroactively implement accessibility.
Is there any conversation within, particularly the Department of Defense and federal, kind of national security space, if you will, given that this is, in TSA, that about this and about beginning to move toward putting some guidelines in place around accessibility? Are you hearing anything?
So I'm not hearing anything. And part of what motivated me to do this work was I got a little worried because I reached out and started talking to some organizations that I knew were using games. I heard some people say things like, oh yeah, we've had to stop using the game engine based games because we actually do have to comply with this. So we're not really doing that dynamic content anymore. We're not really using simulations anymore. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to make sure wasn't happening was that we were going to start turning away from these technologies that we know provide better experiences and better outcomes. Right. Because people are not rising to the challenge of making them accessible. So, I'm trying to sort of shut that narrative of, oh, we can't look at those technologies because, and open it up to, well, if you budget for it and you allow the work to be done, you can still utilize these technologies, right? But I'm not hearing a ton. I know some of our attendees work in these spaces as well and maybe hearing more than I am. But from everyone that I have spoken with, people aren't really talking a ton about it outside of maybe the developer community. Okay. It is part of all of the acquisition requirements. So, but as I said, we've just had those exemptions for so long that I think it sort of has fallen a little bit off to the side.
And Jennifer, who's the attendee here, we do have some work happening in the World Wide Web Consortium on immersive web and digital technologies relevant here. So that's good to know. For those of you that are with us today and are planning to attend ITSEC 2024, you will be able to continue, hopefully, learning more about this. So Jen, you want to talk a little bit about what you'll be doing at ITSEC 2024?
Well, sure. So I don't believe any initial official announcements have come out.
Right.
I did submit a tutorial based on this work with Michael, and he and I are intending to offer a tutorial which will delve much more into actually opening up those guidelines, looking at them, talking about how we implemented, because we do get more time there than we have in a session such as this. So we do intend to be doing that as part of ITSEC this year. And I'll just put in one other plug, which is the Serious Game Showcase and Challenge that happens at ITSEC. We'd love to see accessible products coming in there as well. But we welcome all of the games for training and education to come over to the challenge. The call for that is open now. It's part of ITSEC. It is a nonprofit challenge, and I do help to keep that running as well. So
perhaps, if not this year, in a future year, offering one of the awards or for accessibility could help spur some of this a little bit in the serious game.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to see that.
Yes. Thank you. Yep. Serious Game Challenge. Be sure you check that out. And I'm just going to put in a plug for the ecosystem of learning, which the Serious Game exhibit area is part of a whole footprint of STEM activity on the floor as well. So I encourage you to not only come check out the Serious Games and be sure you vote, but also check out all the other STEM organizations that are there. Well, Jenn, thank you so much. Thank you for the work that you're doing, for the awareness you're raising. In the chat here, it came to light and we were made aware that, oh my goodness, this webinar platform has a closed caption capability and it's not being used. So we're an example of the issue here, right? So for future webinars, that I know Renee and team will turn that on so that we can make it easier to participate in these webinars.
One note on that, I usually use the closed captioning on my own presentations. However, it will fight with the webinar closed captioning. So that's another thing to make sure of. If you're working with your presenters, you need to use one or the other. If you use both, it's often problematic.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Good to know. A lot of us have a lot to learn. So thank you for raising awareness. That's a lot of where it starts. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you for those of you that have been online with us attending this morning. Our September NTSA Tech Growth Connect webinar will be on September 19th. Watch your emails for the announcement about that one and the topic, the paper that we'll be covering there. So Jenn, thank you very much.
Thank you.